Well, welcome back for another installment. Today I want to talk about Muhammad, and specifically I want to talk about some issues in Muhammad's life that help distinguish whether he was a prophet or not, a prophet of God. Now, the reason this is important is because Muslims believe that Muhammad was a prophet of God and that everything he said and did ought to be emulated because he was God's sole representative, he was God's last representative, the best representative of God's will on earth as embodied in the Quran. And so when we take a look at Muhammad's life, we find some very interesting things. We find inconsistencies. We find that the Quran, which is supposed to be the divine revelation of God that has always existed in heaven on eternal tablets, according to Surah 85, verses 21 and 22, this eternally existing scripture, revelation, seems to have in it exceptions that were just carved out specifically for Muhammad during his lifetime in the 7th century. So we're going to take a look at some of those today. We're going to take a look at one or two of those and some other issues in Muhammad's life that are rather quite comical and quizzical. The first issue I want to examine is the issue of Muhammad's wives. Now, the Quran allows Muslim men to marry up to 4 wives, according to Surah 4, chapter 4, verse 3 of the Quran. It says, "And if you fear that you should not be able to deal justly with the orphan girls, then marry women of your choice, 2, 3, or 4. But if you fear that you shall not be able to deal justly with them, then only marry 1, or as many slave girls as your right hand possesses." So the Quran specifically stipulates that Muslim men can marry up to 4 wives if they're able to deal justly and equally, treat them all equitably. And yet when we look at Muhammad's life, Muhammad did not limit himself to just 4 wives as the Quran stipulates. In fact, he had multiple wives, depending on what scholar you listen to, anywhere from 13 to 17 wives. He was married to up to between 9 and 11 women at any one time, consecutively. And so he had many multiple wives. He was in violation of Surah 4, verse 3. And when his followers called him on that, interestingly enough, Muhammad received a very timely revelation, what I call a just-in-time revelation, that got him out of this particular predicament, got him out of a pickle. So in Surah 4:3, Muslim men are allowed to marry 4 wives, but in Surah 33, verse 50, a specific exception is carved out for Muhammad alone. It says, "Muhammad, you're allowed to marry as many wives as you want. A believing woman, if she offers herself to the Prophet and the Prophet wishes to marry her, you can marry as many wives as you want, a privilege for you only and not for the rest of the believers." So here we find a specific exception carved out in the Quran, in this divine revelation for Muhammad, that allowed him to violate an earlier revelation that he had received in Surah 4:3, which stipulates you can only marry 4 wives. A exception was carved out for Muhammad alone in Surah 33:50. And not only that, but even though the Quran allows Muslim men to marry 4 wives, Muhammad carved out another exception, this time for his son-in-law, Ali. Ali was married to Muhammad's daughter Fatima. And Fatima was married to Ali. They had a very loving relationship, but Ali wanted to take on a second wife. And we find in the Hadith of al-Bukhari, the most authoritative collection of Sunni Islam, Hadith collections, the traditions and sayings of Muhammad, we find in al-Bukhari that Muhammad again carved out an exception just for Ali, saying that if you want to marry another wife, then you have to divorce my daughter first in order to marry another wife, because he says, "I do not give you permission because what hurts Fatima hurts me." And so again, we find another very just-in-time revelation, very convenient revelation that Muhammad receives that disallows Ali, Muhammad's son-in-law, from partaking of a second wife because it would hurt the feelings of Muhammad's daughter, Fatima, who was married to Ali. Very, very interesting. Very interesting. Let's get back to this issue of another issue in Surah 4:3, where Muslim men can take on 4 wives, up to 4 wives, if they deal justly with each of them, if they can treat them equally well. Muhammad had a habit of visiting each of his multiple wives on a different night of the week. He would at one time visit one wife one night, visit another wife the next night, and visit another wife the third night, and so on, until he went all the way around the circle. In this sense, he was adhering to and following the stipulation in Surah 4:3, which says you can marry multiple wives as long as you treat each one of them equally well. But over time, Muhammad developed a certain penchant, a certain desire to spend more time with certain wives than others. This again was in violation of Surah 4:3. But we find again another interesting exception carved out for Muhammad himself in Surah 33:51. Again, Muhammad receives another revelation that allows him not to treat each of his wives equally well. It says, "You, O Muhammad, can postpone the turn of whom you will of your wives, and you may receive whom you will." So again, another just-in-time revelation specifically carved out for Muhammad that allowed him to violate an earlier stipulation in the Quran that told him he ought to treat all his wives equally well. In Surah 33:51, Muhammad now can give attention to those wives whom he wants to and postpone the turn of another wife if he wants to, of his own free choosing. So again, another very convenient just-in-time revelation.